Hello, welcome to the lecture on the selection of research participants, also known as sampling procedures. Just to review where we're at in the course, we started off looking at the nature and purpose of research, looking at some basic types of research, putting them into categories such as basic versus applied, quantitative versus qualitative, experimental versus non-experimental, and looked at descriptive research, correlational research, and historical research. In the next chapter we looked at the steps in the research process, talked about selecting the research question and how important that is, and how the research question should guide everything. We talked about types of research questions: descriptive, differential, and relationship questions. We talked about defining the problem in terms of the purpose of the study, delimitations, limitations, and assumptions, and then introduced the concept of variables and spent a bit of time talking about independent and dependent variables and what those look like in different studies. Then we introduced the review of literature, chapter 2 in most master's thesis projects. Talked about how you conduct a review of literature, and gave you a little insight into the library resources. Then we looked at how to develop the research plan, beginning to look specifically on how we propose a study, and talked about different types of hypotheses and the importance of the null hypotheses and the research hypotheses. Looked at different data collection methods, observation, questioning techniques, and how we go about selecting the appropriate observational data collection technique. We had a lecture on the ethical concerns in research. Started off looking at the Nazi Germany experimentation during World War II, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and then looked at UNCW's IRB and the steps that anyone, me, you, anyone at UNCW has to go through if they're going to be approved to conduct research on human participants. So we're moving towards getting you ready to propose your research study, and remember, and I can't say this enough, you are just doing a research proposal. You're not actually doing the study for this course, although I will add that if your proposal is strong and it's something that you're really interested in doing, then in the past I have been able to either work with you myself or partner you up with other faculty to allow you to do that study as a directed individual study. If that fits your plan in terms of, do you have any wiggle room for courses? Can you take another 3-hour course? And do we have the appropriate supervision and materials available for you to conduct the study that you want to go at? We'll talk more about that later in the course when I see some of your proposals. So today we're talking about sampling and how we go about getting people in our study. Now, while all steps in the research process are important, perhaps the most critical or crucial to a successful investigational study are the procedures we use in the selection of our research participants. The researcher first identifies and defines the population from which the information is to be obtained. However, to study an entire population is difficult, if not impossible. Hence the use of the sampling process that we're going to discuss today. We're going to give considerations to factors such as sample size, how representative of the population is the sample, and the appropriateness of the participants to the various research methods and tests. The process of sampling, and this is important, the process of sampling permits the researcher to generalize the results from a study of the sample to the larger population. So our objectives in this lecture are to identify and define a population from which a sample of research participants is to be selected, to explain the importance of randomization in sample selection, to know the various methods of selecting samples, and to know the various factors that are used to determine sample size. So everything that we cover today is going to be related to these four objectives. The concept of sampling has given us some really good real-world examples that brings to life what can go wrong if we don't sample correctly. I'll give you two examples. Here's one from 2012. The results for the South Carolina Republican primary for the presidential candidate from the Republican Party for South Carolina show that Newt Gingrich was by far the pick, or the most popular choice, in the South Carolina Republican primary. However, as you know, Mitt Romney was the winner of the national Republican primary. Even though Newt won South Carolina, Mitt Romney won the whole country. Now, if we were going to try to predict, which is where statistics are often used in terms of elections, if we were going to try to predict the Republican primary winner, and we only used participants in our sample from South Carolina, then we would have had a 40 study. We would have predicted the wrong winner if we would have over-relied on participants in our study, if we had only surveyed people in South Carolina. So it had been very important in this study to survey equally people in all states. Another good example, in fact I've got three examples for you. Here's the second one. In 1936, the Literary Digest magazine collected over 2 million postal surveys, which is a huge sample size, huge, and predicted that the Republican candidate in the US presidential election, Alf Landon, would beat the incumbent president Franklin Roosevelt by a large margin. Well, as you probably know, that did not happen. Roosevelt won. So what happened? They had a huge sample size. Surely they couldn't go wrong with 2 million people answering. Surely that sample size would be able to be generalized to the population. Well, their sampling mistake was that they got the names of these 2 million people from people who bought or subscribed to the Literary Digest. Well, I didn't know this, and maybe you didn't either, but the Literary Digest is mainly bought by rich white Republicans, and rich white Republicans that own motor vehicles. And apparently, not surprisingly at this time, that demographic of the population were much more inclined to vote Republican rather than Democrat, which was Franklin Roosevelt. So this was a sampling mistake, because even though they had a large sample size, it was heavily biased towards one group who voted one way. Here's my favorite example. In 1948, in the presidential election, the Chicago Daily Tribune ran a story early predicting that Dewey defeats Truman. And they did this based on a telephone survey, their sample, where they felt that the survey of the people they were phoning were saying they were voting for Dewey, so they thought they could generalize that to the population. However, as this photo shows us, Truman won. And the Chicago Daily Tribune's mistake was that they only asked rich white people with telephones who they'd vote for. And that led them to state that Dewey's going to win. However, when everyone else got to vote, that's not how it played out. So this kind of thing is becoming less and less common now, as we have all these experts in selection of sampling and populations. But I think these three examples do highlight how that if we sample incorrectly, then we're not going to get the results or the truth that's out there. And that's true in our area too, in kinesiology, exercise science, health, physical education, recreation, sport leadership, tourism management, rec therapy, gerontology. In all of our areas, we can make mistakes sampling, whether it be in the location we get people, how we get people, the type of people we get. If we don't get a representative sample of the population, then we simply cannot say with confidence that our sample can be generalized to the larger population. So, subject selection and sampling is considered highly important in social and behavioral research, which is where we live in our fields. There's three basic questions for us to consider and what I want you to think of as we move through this lecture. Are the research participants appropriate for the research question? Are the research participants representative of the population of interest? And I'm deliberately going slower in this lecture to allow you to fill in the gaps on the PowerPoint. Number 3, how many research participants should be used? Tricky questions. And obviously the realities of the research setting and the practical needs of the researcher often affect the research participant selection process. A physical fitness study involving children may need a large number of participants, whereas a mountain climbing study on the relationship in nutrition and altitude may involve few participants. A researcher studying selected mechanical aspects in pole vaulting cannot select just any pole vaulter. The objective will be to study the high-level world-class vaulters. The availability of these athletes is very likely to present a problem for the researcher. So lots of things to consider. So let's introduce some terms that we're going to be using throughout this lecture. Population refers to an entire group or aggregate of people or elements having one or more common characteristics. For example, in a study, all the 4th grade teachers in New Hanover County schools could be a population. In another study, if you wanted to look at the health behaviors of UNCW students, then the population would be all the UNCW students. If we wanted to look at the study habits of community health majors at UNCW, then our population would be all the community health majors at UNCW. Now, it would be hard for us to do a study where we interview, or we survey, or we observe, or we collect any kind of data on all of the 4th grade teachers, or all of the UNCW students, or all of the community health majors at UNCW. That's going to be almost impossible to do. So we sample a subgroup of each of those. But we want to sample it in such a way that we can confidently generalize our results from our smaller subgroup sample of these populations to the larger population. And how we select that sample is vitally important. So a sample is a small subgroup of a population of interest thought to be representative of that population. So like I just said, that could be a subgroup of 4th grade teachers in New Hanover County schools, a subgroup of UNCW students, a subgroup of community health majors at UNCW. So we need to start thinking about how we can mess up with sampling. Let's say the UNCW students, we wanted to look at, let's see here, fitness and exercise habits of UNCW students. So we say there's 13,000 UNCW students, and we've decided that if we get 100 of those, we think that's enough. But how you get those 100 is important. Let's say you stand outside the Student Rec Center asking questions about fitness. Don't you think that your sample is going to be a little bit biased in terms of fitness behaviors if they're outside, if they're coming out of the rec center? Absolutely. So we need to think about where else you should collect data. Maybe you should also be at the library or outside of other buildings across campus so you don't get biased. Maybe 100's not enough. Maybe you need to make sure you have an equal number of males and females. Maybe if you stand outside certain buildings, you get too many people from a certain major, and that might skew your scores as well. Maybe you need to make sure that you have a certain number from each major on campus. Lots of things to consider. Sampling is the process of selecting a subgroup or sample of the population. So, in terms of representativeness, which is one heck of a word to say, we need to make sure that our sample represents our population. 3 other key terms here. First of all, we have a target population, the big group, all UNCW students. However, we know that we cannot have access to all of those. So a smaller subset of that population is known as the sampling population or the accessible population. That's still a big number, but it's the number of the population that we can get to if we wanted to. And then the smaller group within that is the sample that we select from that sampling population. Each textbook has a chapter, each research methods textbook has a chapter talking about sampling, and each one comes up with some slightly different steps in the sampling process. The textbook that we use for this class gives us the following 5 steps. Number 1, first step is we have to identify the target population. Step 2, we have to identify the accessible population. Step 3, we have to determine the desired sample size. Step 4, we have to select the specific sampling technique, which is where we're going to move to in this lecture. And then number 5, we have to do it. We have to implement the sampling plan. The magic word for today is random. And I often joke with my classes teaching this lecture that if you're unsure of an answer on a test and one of the choices says random in it, in research terms it's probably correct, because random processes are a magical technique that usually give us the representativeness that we're looking for from the sample to the population. So random processes in terms of sampling are important to the quality of research for 4 main reasons. It ensures, or usually ensures, the representativeness of the sample to the population. It will allow the researcher to show to the peer reviewers and to anyone reading the study that they were unbiased during the selection of participants in their study. If we use random selection and random assignment, it allows us to equalize characteristics among groups. Chances are, if we have a large enough sample size, that characteristics such as gender, age, physical abilities, and other characteristics will be spread out equally amongst groups if we have groups in our study. And finally, random processes are the basic requirement of inferential statistical tests. Tests such as t-tests and ANOVAs, one of the requirements is that there was randomization in the selection of participants. And later on in the course, we'll discuss further about how randomization is important in establishing strong internal and external validity, and to making sure or ensuring that we control extraneous variables and that we can generalize our results from the sample to the population. So random selection. The purpose is to enable the researcher to generalize results to a larger population. Therefore, the researcher is concerned about the representativeness of the subjects in the sample. Here we begin to look at the term external validity. So random selection is how we select the participants from the population. Random assignment is once we've selected that group or that total number of people in our study, and we want to have 2, 3, 4 groups in our study doing different things, then we can use randomization procedures to assign those people to those different groups. So random assignment, the purpose is to enable the researcher to assume that groups are equivalent at the beginning of the study. This adds control to a study. It has nothing to do with the selection of the sample. We've already got the selection of the sample. All we're doing is using random assignment to put people into different groups within our study. So let's say that you've randomly selected 100 people from the 13,000 students at UNCW. You want to try 4 different treatments. So you randomly put those 100 people into 4 groups of 25. We can use random selection to get those 100 people total. We can use random assignment to put those 100 people into 4 equal groups of 25. That ensures, if we have a large enough sample size, good internal validity, which we're going to look at later in this course. Sample selection methods. Probability sampling uses sampling techniques in which the probability of selecting each participant is known. It utilizes random processes but does not guarantee the sample is representative of the population. It allows us to estimate the sampling error in the study. As opposed to non-probability sampling, this is when samples are not selected at random. It's very difficult to claim the sample is representative of the population. And in non-probability sampling, we're often talking about intact groups and volunteers. We can do better than that. Probability sampling and the different techniques in probability sampling are usually the way that we want to go in selecting our sample. So in probability sampling, it's possible for us to estimate the sampling error, and all the sampling error is the extent to which the sample values deviate from those that would be obtained if the entire population was sampled, which is hard to do because often we don't know that parameter or that statistic, but using these techniques, it allows us to estimate that sampling error. In this lecture, we're going to talk about simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, systematic sampling, and cluster sampling as examples of probability sampling methods. There's others out there, but these are the ones that we're going to look at in this lecture. For non-probability sampling, we're going to look at purposive sampling and convenience sampling, and we'll talk about in what situations those types of techniques will be appropriate to use. And I'm going to stop right there and end this first part in the lecture on sampling, and we'll pick it up in the second part of this lecture by going into each of these individually and looking at some examples and trying to apply it to real-world situations.